She tore up a $5 million check in front of an 8-year-old girl. Then she called the police on the little girl's father. What Karen Voss didn't know in that moment was that the man she'd just humiliated held the fate of her entire bank in the palm of his hand. And in the next 10 minutes, she was going to find out the hard way, in front of every single person in that lobby. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money." That's what she said, sneering, right before she ripped the check in half and let the pieces fall to the floor at his feet. His daughter watched every second of it happen. The man's name was Marcus Reid. And what happens next isn't just satisfying. It's the kind of ending that makes you want to stand up out of your chair and cheer. Stay with me on this one, because by the time this video ends, you're going to understand exactly why the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one who looks like he has nothing to lose. Let's rewind. Because to understand why this single afternoon mattered so much, you need to understand exactly who Marcus Reid really was, and why almost nobody in his own town actually knew. Marcus was 42 years old. For 6 years, he had been raising his daughter Lily, completely alone in a small house on the edge of a quiet town called Willow Creek. The kind of place where nobody looked twice at an old sedan or a jacket that had seen better days. His wife had left both of them behind years earlier for a different life in a different city, and Marcus had done the only thing that made sense to him. He kept going. He drove Lily to school every single morning, cooked dinner every night, even the nights he'd been up working until 2 in the morning. He never missed a recital, never missed a parent-teacher meeting, never once let his daughter feel like she came second to anything. And here's the part nobody in Willow Creek knew. The man in the faded jacket, driving the used sedan nobody looked twice at, he had built a company called Reid Capital Partners from absolutely nothing into a firm that managed billions of dollars. Marcus kept it buried on purpose. He didn't want his daughter growing up believing that money made a person important, or that a man's worth could be read off the label of his coat. So he wore the same watch he'd worn for a decade, drove the same car he'd bought used years earlier, and let his success live quietly in the background of an otherwise ordinary life, visible only to the handful of people who actually needed to know it existed. That morning, everything was about to collide. A check for $5 million had just cleared into Marcus's hands. The proceeds from an early stake he'd sold in a small tech company most people had never heard of until it made national headlines. He already knew, down to the dollar, where that money was going. Half would go into a fund for Lily's future, untouched until she was old enough to understand what it meant. The other half was meant to seed a scholarship for kids being raised by a single mother or father. The exact kind of family he understood better than almost anyone alive, having lived every exhausting version of it himself. He brought Lily along because they had a whole afternoon planned, one she'd been talking about since breakfast. Bank first, then the bookstore, then dinner at her favorite diner on Sycamore Street. 10 minutes at the bank, tops, a formality before the two of them went back to just being father and daughter instead of founder and dependent. He'd even promised her 3 books instead of the usual one, since he was in a good mood. Neither of them had any idea that 10 minutes was about to become the worst afternoon of their lives. And then, not long after, the most important one. They walked into the Brannigan branch of Ironbridge National Bank not long before closing. Marcus had banked there for 15 years. 15. Since before Lily was born. Since before Reid Capital had a name anyone outside a small circle of investors would recognize. But the woman behind the manager's desk that day had only transferred to that branch a few weeks earlier. She didn't know his history. She'd never once pulled up his account. She had no idea that the man in the worn jacket had been a fixture on that branch's ledgers for a decade and a half before she'd ever set foot inside the building. Her name was Karen Voss. And the moment Marcus and Lily walked through those doors, her eyes did something you've probably seen happen to someone else before. Up and down, taking him in, then out the window to the car he'd parked at the curb. Customers who walked in wearing press suits were greeted before they'd even reached the counter. Marcus and Lily stood there while 3 tellers stayed exactly where they were, suddenly very busy with paperwork. Lily tugged at her father's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her to be patient. It never pays, he said, to assume the worst about people before they've done anything to earn it. He had no idea how badly that piece of advice was about to be tested. When he finally reached the counter, he placed the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he'd held for 15 years. The number on that check caught the teller's attention instantly, and within seconds, Karen was standing behind the counter herself, her voice rising loud enough that half the lobby could hear her demanding to know where the money had come from. Marcus didn't flinch. He handed over his driver's license, his bank card, his account number, the paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He even offered to let Karen call the issuing bank directly, right there at the counter, so she could verify every detail herself in a matter of minutes. Karen looked at the documents without actually looking at them. Then she said the line that would end her career. A man carrying a $5 million check would not be driving a car like yours, or wearing a coat like that. A young teller named Sophia Nguyen offered to make the verification call herself. Karen cut her off before she could even reach for the phone, ordering her back to her station in a tone that left no room for discussion. And that's when the phones came out. Several customers had already noticed the tension building at the counter, and a few of them had their phones raised before Karen had even finished her sentence. Not to help, just to watch. One man said, loud enough for Lily to hear, that a man like Marcus might be using his own daughter to make a scam look more convincing. Nobody in that lobby said a single word against him. Lily's hand found her father's and gripped it tight, her earlier confidence draining out of her all at once. And Marcus, still calm, still even, asked Karen one more time to please just make the call before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her. In front of the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming, Karen announced that the check was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Marcus told her, evenly, that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and needed to think very carefully about what she did next. She heard that as a threat instead of a warning. She snatched the check off the counter, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that people like him did not walk into her branch with $5 million. Then she tore it in half, then into smaller pieces, and let them fall to the floor at his feet, in full view of his daughter. The lobby went completely silent. Lily bent down as if to gather the torn pieces, but Marcus stopped her gently. He wasn't about to let his 8-year-old kneel on that floor to pick up what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Karen and said one sentence, quiet and level, without ever raising his voice. You just made the most expensive mistake of your career. Karen called the police, told the dispatcher a man was using fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. Then she ordered the branch's security guard to escort him out. His name was Owen Marsh, and he hesitated visibly before stepping forward, uncertain why he was being told to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from his manager, in front of a lobby full of witnesses, didn't leave him a lot of room to argue. Lily looked up as the guard approached, her eyes wide with a fear no 8-year-old should ever have to carry into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Marcus tightened his hand around hers and kept his voice low, just for her, telling her everything would be fine as long as she stayed close. He understood exactly what position he was in. He could resist, and risk turning a bad situation into something dangerous with Lily standing right beside him. Or he could stay calm and wait for the truth to catch up to the moment. He chose not to fight the order. But he also refused to walk out that door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced down at the torn pieces of paper scattered across the tile, the remnants of a scholarship fund that hadn't even had a chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to certainty. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about a $5 million check. It had become about every assumption a room full of strangers had made about him before he ever said a word. And here's where it gets worse before it gets better. As Owen walked them toward the glass doors, Lily kept looking back at the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the floor. She wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressed her face into his side, and begged the guard in a small voice not to take him away. Karen called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Lily back so the girl couldn't obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. That was the one moment Marcus's calm actually cracked. He had absorbed the accusations about the check, the insults about his car and his coat, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the second someone suggested putting hands on his daughter, his voice changed completely. No one touches her. Karen seized on that reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she'd been warning everyone about since he walked through the door. Marcus understood, in that instant, that every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being run through a lens that had already decided who he was before he'd ever spoken. He lowered his voice, kept his hands visible at his sides, and pulled Lily in close enough that she was standing against his hip instead of anywhere near the guard. It struck him, standing there, how quickly a father's instinct to protect his own child could be twisted into evidence against him. Sophia tried to intervene again, the second time since the confrontation began. She reminded Karen, as steadily as she could manage, that Marcus hadn't threatened anyone, and that one phone call to the issuing bank would settle the entire matter in minutes. Karen turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word in front of customers who were still recording every second of it. Sophia stopped talking, but something in her expression suggested she believed him completely, even if she couldn't say so out loud without risking her job. And through all of it, every phone still raised, every set of eyes conveniently finding somewhere else to look. Nobody moved. Nobody stepped in. They wanted the spectacle. Nobody wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger they'd never met before that day. Lily looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and lowered eyes and asked her father, in a voice just loud enough to carry, "Nobody's going to say he didn't do anything wrong?" Several people looked away when she said it. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. That silence hit Marcus harder than anything Karen had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should ever have to learn in a bank lobby on an ordinary afternoon. And then, right as Owen walked them the last few steps toward the door, everything changed in the space of 2 words. The door swung open, and a man named Victor Calloway walked in, briefcase in one hand, completely unaware of what he was about to step into. Victor was the regional president of the bank's entire Eastern Division, and he'd come to the Brannigan branch specifically to meet Marcus after hours, away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The two of them were supposed to be finalizing a deal between the bank and Reid Capital Partners worth $750 million. A deal months in the making, scheduled to close within the week. Victor took 2 steps inside before he understood what he was looking at. Marcus Reid, the man he'd spent the better part of an hour preparing to meet. Standing there with a security guard's hand on his shoulder, his daughter clinging to his side in tears. Scraps of paper scattered across the floor near his feet. His briefcase slipped out of his hand and hit the tile with a heavy thud. "Mr. Reid," Victor said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that made every head turn, and the entire temperature of the room changed. Owen released Marcus's arm immediately, stepping back like the shoulder he'd been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Karen rushed toward Victor, already explaining that she'd just prevented a $5 million fraud attempt. Victor looked at her for a long moment, then asked one question. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" She didn't, and in that instant, she realized the question hadn't been rhetorical at all. In front of every customer still in that lobby, Victor explained it plainly. Marcus Reid was the founder of Reid Capital Partners, one of the largest institutional clients the bank currently held. Reid Capital was in the final stages of a $750 million agreement with Ironbridge National, and Marcus was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from it. The $5 million check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had sent confirmation early that same morning, a confirmation Karen had never once bothered to check before deciding what she believed about the man standing at her counter. Victor knelt down to Lily's eye level and apologized to her directly. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time since they'd walked through those doors that anyone in that building had spoken to Lily like her fear actually mattered. 2 words had been enough to reverse everything. The phones lowered, though nobody deleted the footage sitting in their pockets. The man who'd loudly accused Marcus of using his own daughter to sell a scam suddenly found his shoes very interesting, making no effort to meet anyone's eyes. Karen wasn't done. She straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last 10 minutes. She insisted that Marcus bore some blame for the entire incident, that a man carrying $5 million should have dressed the part, or at the very least identified himself the moment he walked through the door. Marcus asked her, without raising his voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy or well-known before he deserved basic decency. Karen said she'd only been following procedure. Twice, as though repeating it might make it true. Victor gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. There wasn't one. There never had been. Karen fumbled for an answer and found none. She looked around the lobby, at the tellers who wouldn't meet her eyes, at the customers still holding their phones, and for the first time seemed to understand that no one in that room was going to help her out of the corner she'd backed herself into. So she pivoted again, this time blaming Marcus for bringing his daughter into the bank at all, suggesting her presence had made the entire situation more emotional than it needed to be. That comment was the moment Marcus stopped extending her any benefit of the doubt whatsoever. And something in his expression made even Victor take half a step back. Victor ordered Karen to surrender her employee badge and her keys immediately, instructing her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and every note attached to her station that day would be preserved for an internal investigation, he told her, in front of everyone still standing in the lobby. While attention stayed fixed on Marcus and Victor, Karen quietly slipped behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she'd added to Marcus's account only minutes earlier, one that described him as a threatening customer with a high risk of fraud. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard, like she believed the whole thing could still be cleaned up if she just moved quickly enough. Sophia noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye. She crossed the lobby before Karen could finish, placing a hand flat on the keyboard mid-motion, stopping the deletion cold. She told Karen plainly the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Victor and told him something that changed everything. The branch's security cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the exact moment Karen tore the check apart in front of Lily. Karen's face went pale, like she'd completely forgotten the whole exchange had been on film from the second Marcus walked through the door. Victor fired her on the spot. Right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who'd watched her tear the check apart less than 10 minutes earlier. She asked to have the conversation privately, in an office. He refused her outright, telling her plainly that she'd humiliated Mr. Reid in public, and she'd answer for it in front of the same people who'd witnessed it happen. Owen got a different outcome. The footage showed he'd never used force against Marcus, and had released him the instant Victor spoke. Victor suspended him pending a full review instead of firing him outright, telling him the time off would give both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before deciding anything permanent. Owen's shoulders dropped with something between relief and shame. "I knew something felt wrong," he admitted, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so out loud." Marcus, still holding Lily against his side, found he had no anger left for the guard, a man who'd at least had the decency to hesitate, unlike the woman who'd given the order. The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Karen had placed earlier, describing a man attempting fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers walked in scanning the lobby, and for one more second, Marcus felt that same tightening in his chest, bracing for another round of assumptions before anyone had asked him a single question. Victor tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the officers still had to file an incident report. Karen's original call had already been logged as an official complaint before anyone corrected the record. One of the officers apologized quietly while taking down Marcus's account of events, admitting under his breath that the dispatch call had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were actually looking at. Marcus stood through the questioning with Lily still pressed against him, answering every question short and factual, refusing to let his frustration bleed into anything the officers might misread as agitation. Sophia gave her account without hesitation, describing exactly what she'd seen and heard from the moment Marcus and Lily first walked through the doors, including the moment Karen threatened to fire her for offering to make a simple phone call. Several customers who'd been recording came forward too, handing over footage that showed exactly what Karen had said and done, from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A few of them apologized to Marcus directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started. One 10-second clip, Karen tearing the check apart and letting the pieces fall at Marcus's feet while Lily watched, was already online before the police had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Marcus and Lily left that evening, the video had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had reached national attention. News vans appeared outside the Brannigan branch before the sun had even set. Reporters quickly discovered that Marcus was a single father who'd raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $5 million Karen had torn apart was meant to help launch a scholarship fund for kids being raised by single parents, just like him. Old photos of Marcus dropping Lily off at school surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors describing him as quiet, private, and the last person anyone expected to be at the center of a national story. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated only deepened the outrage building around the story with every new share and every new headline. Commentators debated the footage for days. Karen's exact words, "People like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," got repeated across every major outlet until it became impossible to escape. Local news stations replayed the 10-second clip during every broadcast that week, followed by panels arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated their customers. And then a few outlets went digging and found something worse. Karen had a documented history. Complaints from customers she'd frozen out, denied, or dismissed over the years, never once making it past an internal file before that week. Investigators found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched, each one closed without any real review. One former teller, who'd left the branch nearly 2 years earlier, told investigators she'd reported an incident almost identical to Marcus's, involving an elderly customer whose account Karen had frozen without explanation. That complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week. No action taken. Buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen, until a $5 million check ended up torn apart on that same lobby floor. This wasn't one manager's bad afternoon anymore. This was proof that an entire system had allowed the same pattern to continue, unchecked, for years. Ironbridge National's stock began sliding as the video circulated. The board convened an emergency session that same evening, pressuring Victor to do whatever was necessary to keep Marcus from walking away from the $750 million deal. Executives who had never once asked about a single branch manager before that afternoon suddenly wanted to know how fast the situation could be contained. Victor spent most of that night on the phone, fielding calls from people who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the little girl who'd watched her father accused of fraud in a room full of strangers. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Marcus before the story grew any larger. Victor refused every time. "This man cannot be bought into silence," he told them, "and trying will likely make it worse for everyone involved." Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud, no threat of any kind, and that Karen's original report had been false from the start. It was a small measure of official vindication that did absolutely nothing to undo what Lily had already witnessed. Karen lost her job. Her banking license was on the verge of revocation. A civil rights lawsuit was already forming, on top of a criminal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers had already started reaching out, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. Case closed. Marcus cleared. Justice served. Except, that's not actually where this story ends. Because that night, sitting across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, Lily looked up and asked one question that changed everything. Would anyone have apologized at all, she asked, if they hadn't found out he was rich? Marcus set down his fork. And he had no answer for her, not one that didn't feel like a lie. Because he knew, sitting there with her question hanging in the air, that he'd only been cleared because he happened to hold a kind of power almost nobody else walking into a bank like that would ever have. Right now, somewhere out there, someone without a regional president rushing in to vouch for them was being treated exactly the way he had been. Except nobody was coming to call them sir. Nobody was coming to save them at all. Everyone online wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about the people who didn't happen to be carrying one worth $5 million. The ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news. 3 days later, the lawyers showed up at his door. Suits that looked completely out of place against his modest porch and the old sedan parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared. A financial settlement. A public apology from the bank. The termination of a few employees. All of it in exchange for one simple condition. Marcus would sign the $750 million agreement as planned, and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Brannigan branch. They laid the paperwork out across his kitchen table. the same table where Lily had asked her question 3 nights earlier, and walked him through the numbers like the size of the settlement alone might be enough to make the matter disappear. Marcus let them finish. He watched Lily doing her homework quietly in the next room, while grown men in suits discussed how to make a public humiliation vanish from the news cycle. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely. Take Lily somewhere far from cameras and reporters, and never set foot in another Ironbridge branch for the rest of his life. But he kept thinking about Lily's question. About the customers who'd stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything, saying nothing. About how easily an entire room had agreed, through silence, to let an injustice happen right in front of them. About Owen's admission, that he'd known something felt wrong and hadn't trusted himself enough to act on it. And about how many other employees, at branches all over the country, probably carried that same quiet doubt without ever being given permission to speak it out loud. Punishing Karen would satisfy his own anger. It would do absolutely nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional president waiting nearby to vouch for them. So Marcus told the lawyers he'd keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright. He had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account, and everything to do with what happened the next time someone without his last name walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, conducted by outside investigators, not the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require sign-off from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose, instead of being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he'd watched happen to Sophia in the middle of that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Owen, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly, in plain language, inside every branch. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files long before Marcus ever walked through the doors of the Brannigan branch. And finally, Ironbridge National would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the very money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. But with the deal and the company's reputation, both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Victor sat through most of those negotiations himself, reminding the board more than once that the cost of refusing Marcus's terms would almost certainly exceed the cost of accepting them. Within the week, every condition had been written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Karen's banking license was permanently revoked. She now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the criminal charge for filing a false police report. Employees who'd helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Owen was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he'd never used force against Marcus and had let go the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how Owen's hand had never once tightened on his arm, and how he'd let go the second Victor spoke. It was a small distinction, but it was one Marcus had carried with him in the weeks since, and he wanted Owen to know it hadn't gone unnoticed. Sophia was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the staff training program across the entire region, all because she'd been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Marcus made a point of thanking her personally before he left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Marcus split the money exactly as he'd always planned. Half went into the fund securing Lily's future. The other half became the seed money for the Reid Family Scholarship, a program built to support the children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own, the way he once had. Marcus insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Brannigan branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. A place that had turned him and his daughter away would now be the place responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. 3 months later, Marcus and Lily walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same sedan, wore the same jacket. He wasn't about to change anything about himself just because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Lily held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time. Just the easy comfort of a kid walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. The bank, though, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Marcus's coat or his car keys before deciding how he should be treated. And for the first time since that first visit, Lily didn't ask why nobody was helping them yet. A new placard stood near the entrance, listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Sophia came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Owen stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who'd once stood there filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again. Marcus noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Lily had faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Lily watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he hadn't just closed the bank down after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than just hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Making it open for everyone is harder. Lily nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind instead of simply accepting it. She looked back at the young mother at the counter, then up at her father again, like she was measuring the distance between the fear she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her. Before they left, Marcus let Lily hand the very first scholarship letter to a young student being raised by a single father, and watching his daughter's face, he could see she finally understood something. The $5 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he'd had the power to seek revenge, and chose instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier. A stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on Sycamore Street. If you'd been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone? Or would you have been the first person to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $5 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus didn't win the day Karen's boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they were carrying with them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.